Today we're going to be starting our final project for our Texture Basics course, but you can also use this video if you want to learn how to make this brick material. So to start off, I'm going to add a couple of objects into my scene. I'll press Shift and then A, then under Mesh I'll left click UV Sphere. The reason I'm going with the UV Sphere is it comes with a UV that works well for brick textures. Then I'm going to press Ctrl and then 1 to add a subdivision surface modifier. When you hold down Ctrl and then press a number on the keyboard, it will create a subdivision surface modifier with that number of subdivisions. So if I was to press Ctrl 2, it would create a subdivision surface modifier with 2 subdivisions here. I'll right click my object and left click Shade Smooth. Next up, I'm going to add a cube. So I'll press Shift A, under Mesh I'll left click Cube. Press G and X to move this along, S and Y, and I'm going to press 0.5. And what that's done is it's half this cube on the Y axis. This is important for when we edit the UV, so make sure you do it at 0.5 just now. Then I'm going to press S and type in number 2. That should be big enough for now. I'll then press G and Z and I'll pull this up. Now we're going to set up our first material. So I'm going to left click on my third option here, which will take us into material preview. Then I'm going to drag up my timeline and change it from timeline to shader editor. I'll then left click plus new, and I'm going to left click material.001 and call it brick. Then I'm going to left click my other object, left click this drop down here and left click brick. And now both these objects are using the same material. Now I'm going to press Shift A on the keyboard, and under input I'm going to left click texture coordinate. Then I'm going to press Shift A, then under texture I'm going to left click brick texture. I want you to have a think about which texture coordinate we're going to use here. If you guessed UV, you are correct. If you didn't remember though, that's fine, since this was one of the exceptions to our usual rule. Since for a lot of these built-in textures, we usually use the object coordinate for a good result. Now I'll plug my color of my brick texture into the base color. Now we can see how things are looking. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to left click and drag my top corner here, and I'm going to open my UV editor. The UV editor allows us to see the UV of our object, which is very important since we're using the UV texture coordinate here. You won't be able to see it in object mode, so we'll need to left click our object. I'm going to select the cube one first, press tab and enter edit mode. As you can see, we've got this cross shape by default, but since we're using bricks here, I'm going to want to use a cube projection. So first I'll press A to select everything, and that'll select all my vertices, faces or edges, and then I can press U and then left click cube projection. Now you can see that's looking a lot better, but you can notice that the ones on the side are thinner. It's because we halved this cube. Another thing we should do is go into object mode, press Ctrl A and apply the scale. This means that this object's scale here, seen in the item menu, are all set to 1 now, whereas before it was set to X1, Z1 and Y at 0.5. I'll press N to get out of this menu, I'll press Tab to go back into edit mode. Then I'm going to press 3 on the keyboard to go into face select mode. Left click away from my cube to unselect everything. First we're going to do our left and right faces. So I'll left click this face here, and then I'll shift left click the one on the other side. We're going to want to do this separately from the top and bottom faces. Then as you can see in our UV editor here, despite these faces being smaller in the object, they're the same size as the front facing faces, even though they're half the size. As some of you might imagined, to fix this all we need to do is press A in our UV editor, S and then X to scale it across the X axis, then type in the number 0.5. Now you can see things are looking a lot better. If you want to make things look even more better, we can press A to select everything in our UV editor that we have selected, and we can drag it along to the far left. But of course we don't want it to go out the bounds, so we're going to want to left click UV, and we're going to left click constrain image to bounds. Now when we press G and X, you can notice we can't go outside the bounds, and we can also try doing it the other way, G and then X, and pull it along. You can choose which one you'd prefer. And if we want to return it to the middle, all we would need to do is press G, X, and then minus 0.25. And if it was the other way, we would have to do 0.25. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that. Now we're going to fix the top 2 faces. So I've turned my overlays off just so you could see what I was doing better, but I've still got these 2 faces selected. To turn my overlays on and off, I just press this button here. Now I'm going to left click this top face, hold down Shift and left click the bottom face. Again we've got the same problem. This UV is too big, so I'll press A, S, this time we're going to press Y and then 0.5, and if you want we can easily press G and Y and pull this up to the top, but it's up to you. I think it looks better like this though, at least on this side. So great, now we've got the UV working on our brick wall here, but what about our sphere? It looks a little bit distorted. Unfortunately we won't be able to get things perfect on the sphere, but we can make things look a little better. So we can press Tab and enter edit mode. Press A to select everything. You can see this is the default default UV that Blender has given us. I'll press A and I'll press S and Y, and I'm going to change things a little bit so things are looking a bit more cube-like. You can just adjust it to a point you're happy with, and then you can just press Tab to come back into object mode. Now that's sorted, we're going to add an easy lighting setup. So I'm going to add an environment texture, which is how we add HDRIs in Blender. In the world properties setting, I'll press plus new if I don't have a world in my scene already, otherwise you can use the same one. Make sure my strength is set to 1, and I'm going to left click this yellow circle beside color. Then I can change to environment texture, left click open, and then I'll go ahead and find my HDR file in my downloads. I've left the texture I'm using in the description below. You'll see there's no difference, and that's because we're in the material preview mode, whereas we're really going to be working in the render preview mode. Now you can see our shader showing up, but I'm going to go ahead and under film in my render properties, turn on transparent. That way we can focus on the bricks themselves. The reason I'm using cycles and not Eevee is because sometimes Eevee can be a little bit slow when processing textures. However, once the textures are processed, it works a lot faster than cycles. So do keep that in mind. So the first thing I'm going to do is left click my brick texture, then shift left click my texture coordinate, and I'm going to press Ctrl G. Some of you might be confused as to why I'm doing this. Because we're making a very big material in this tutorial, I feel like making things as compact as possible is very necessary. And then I'm going to press this arrow here to come out, and I'll left click my node group, and I'm going to call it brick color and roughness. To make things even more clear and organized, I'm going to press Ctrl J, and that's going to open up one of these boxes here. This is called a frame, and it allows us to put multiple nodes inside of things to keep things organized. Then I'm going to set the enable to brick color and roughness. You can also set a custom color if you wish, so maybe I'll set this to a red color, but you can set it to any color or name you like. Then I'm going to open up my node tree by left clicking these two nodes here. I'm going to make sure my mortar smoothness is set to 0.1. I'm going to leave all the settings at their default, but if you want to learn how some of these different settings work, you can have a look at my built-in textures tutorial or one of my PDF guides which explains brick textures. Link to both in the description below. Then I'm going to create another group in here, and this is because we're going to be reusing this exact brick node, and I want to make sure I can change it across everywhere where I'm using this brick texture. This isn't something you have to do usually, but the reason I'm doing this and why I think you should use the method I'm using here is because it will help with organization, which for tutorials like these and for fixing materials at a later date, I believe is essential. So I'll press Ctrl G, and you can see all these settings will be saved. Although I have made a brief mistake here. I meant to contain this texture coordinate within this node group. So I'll press Ctrl C, then press X to delete, left click this node button, and press Ctrl V. Then I'm going to connect my UV to my vector, and from the group input, I'm going to left click it, then under group where it says inputs, I'll left click this and press the minus button to remove it. And in my group input, I'm going to remove everything apart from the yellow circles, since I'm going to want to keep those editable outside of the node for now. Now back here, I'm going to rename my node group to, and this will be used a lot in this material. Then I'll press Shift D just so I can show you how this works. The colors we have on the surface, we can edit, and you'll notice when I edit one, it won't edit the other one. However, when I go inside the brick, if I edit one of these parameters to, let's say, 7.1 for the scale, then I come out and then I check the other one, the scale on this one will be 7.1 as well. So I'll set this back to 5, and I'll reset it to 5 on both of them. So think of it like this. Everything that's on the surface of a node group can be edited individually, whereas everything inside will edit it on all of these nodes. So you can think of it as the inside as being the inner workings of this node, and therefore it will apply the changes to all of the same node. But just like if we had two different noise textures, if we edit the parameter of one, it isn't going to edit the parameter of another. However, if we were to change the nature of the noise texture itself, which I don't think we can actually do in Blender, but just for example, if we could, it would change it for all noise texture nodes. If this is confusing, don't worry, we're going to keep going, and hopefully you can pick it up some more as we keep going. I'll press X to delete this brick here. Now we're in this node group here. I'm going to create 3 new inputs. The first one I'm going to call brick 1, and the second one I'll call brick 2. Then the final one I will call mortar. And this is how we're going to control our color from the main shader editor. But you can see there's a bit of a problem. These sockets are grey, which means they'll convert this yellow information into grey information, which isn't what we want. But for now, let's connect up color 1 to brick 1, color 2 to brick 2, and mortar to mortar. Now we're going to select one of these here and change it the type from float to color. And I'm going to do the same for all of these. And you can see they're now all turning yellow. Then I'll press this arrow here to go up. Now we can go ahead and create a color. For my first color, I'm going to create a much brighter color. I'm going to go for a purplish red. Around here should do for now. Then for my brick 2, increase the brightness again. And I'm going to have a more mellow red here. I'll go to my brick brick 1 and I'll make it quite a bit darker. I'm also going to change my mortar to completely white since I want the bits in between my brick to be this white colour. I've tweaked around with my colour a lot and I think I'm happy with how these are looking here. So for brick 1 I'm using this hex value here, which is 64171F, and for brick 2 the hex value I'm using is BF4C51. So you can use those if you want to get the exact same colour as me, although I may adjust things a little bit later. And for the mortar we've just got completely white. Next up we need to add an additional output, and this output is going to be our roughness. So I'll scroll down in my group menu here and I'm going to press plus on the output. I'm going to rename colour to base colour and I'm going to change output to roughness. Now I'm going to preview my factor, which is a node wrangler feature which we covered earlier in the tutorial. If you don't have this enabled you can just watch just now. Under factor you can see we've got this permanent black and white mask, and this will not be changed by the colour of our brick texture, but this alone would make it so the brick is really reflective and the mortar is really rough, whereas we actually want to kind of have it the other way around. But an invert node wouldn't be suitable here since we don't want it to be completely white and black since it's way too much contrast. So I'll press Shift A and I'm going to search for mix RGB. I want you to have a guess what we're going to use this factor as. See if you can remember the word I'm looking for. If you guessed mask, you're correct. We are going to be using this factor as a mask. Now I'm going to plug my colour back into the temp viewer just so we can see it. And you can see things are completely white. The reason this has turned out like this is because we've set black, which is colour 1, to be this grey colour, and the white is the exact same. So since colour 1 is black, you notice if I turn it to black, we get what looks like our original mask. But we were wanting these black parts to be more rough than the mortar. So I'm going to go around just over halfway, although we may adjust this later. Then for colour 2, I'm going to bring this down to much more grey. Then I'm going to plug this colour into the roughness, and now I'll go up. Then I'll move my principled BSDF, and I'm just going to get rid of this temp viewer here. Then I'm going to take my roughness and plug it into the roughness of my shader, and then I'll plug my BSDF into the surface. Now we have some roughness variety on our bricks. Now to finish off here, we're going to make our bump. The first bump we'll be using even when we're using displacement, and this is going to act as our surface imperfections. So first what I'm going to do is press Shift A and I'm going to come to group. Then I'll left click brick, and now we've got this brick that we made earlier. This brick texture is different from the standard one because we can edit the parameters inside to affect all of the other brick nodes. Then we can press Shift A and I'm going to search for a mix RGB. Then I'll plug my factor, which was that black and white mask, into the factor of my mix RGB. I'm going to use this to add surface imperfection to black, the first one, colour 1, which will be the bricks themselves, and colour 2, which is representing the mortar here. I'm going to left click my brick, shift left click my mix RGB and press Ctrl G, and now we've got it into a group. I'm going to go ahead and plug my colour into the output, and since this is black and white, if you want you can change this type to float. Then I'm going to call this height. Now how would we go about adding our imperfections? Well, a great node we can use is the noise texture. So I'll press Shift A, then under texture I'll left click noise texture, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll press Shift A. Under input I'm going to left click texture coordinate. I'll plug my object this time since noise texture works really well with object. What object does is spreads the texture around the object relatively evenly. Then we can plug our factor into colour 2 and the other factor into colour 1. But right now we can't see any of the changes we're making. So I'm going to come out of this. I'm going to change this node group to imperfection height. Press Shift A. I'm going to search for bump. I'll plug my imperfection height into the height and normal into the normal. Now you can see the change that's made. I'm going to change these roughness values to 1 so we get the full effect of the detail parameter. Second one I'm going to set to something high like 10. Remember this second one here is going to be for our mortar and the first one will be for our main bricks. I'm going to change my scale to something like 50 and I'm going to set my mortar to maybe 10 since I want it to be a little bit bigger on the mortar. Then I'm going to press this arrow to go up. I'm also going to turn my strength down to 0.05. Now you can see we've got our subtle imperfection. Now if we wanted to make this look more intense, you could easily increase this value to something like 0.3, 0.4 or maybe even higher than that. It's really up to you. Next up we're going to do the bump version of the brick and mortar protrusions. So I'll press Shift A and I'm going to search for another bump. I'm going to plug this in between these two normals here. Remember, since this has been stored in a normal channel, even if I just change the strength on this bump here, it won't affect the previous bump. Then I'm going to press Shift A, then under group I'll left click brick, and I'll plug my factor into the height. You're going to see it's the wrong way around. And so you can see this subtle bump effect is making it so the mortar is being pushed out, which is not what we want. To fix this, we could either use an invert node, or more simply, we can just press invert on this bump node here. And now you can see our bricks are protruding outwards. In my project file, which I have linked below, I've made a displacement which makes use of the shader displacement. However, this won't work on a lot of people's computers and even struggles on mine. So we're going to be using the displacement modifier instead. But for that, we're going to need to bake a displacement map. So to do that, we're going to want to bake our height, but we have a problem. It's being inverted, but it's being inverted by the bump node, which won't be much help to us since we don't bake the height map through the bump node. Rather, we bake it through the emission. So I'm going to make sure on my principled shader here that my emission strength is set to 1. Then I'm going to unplug my height here and plug it into the emission. This will look really weird just now, but don't worry, this is just for baking. Making sure we're in cycles, I'm going to change my viewport to solid mode just to keep things nice and fast. And in render, I'm going to set my max samples to 10 since we don't need loads of render samples for baking. Then I'm going to uncheck this invert option here since we're not going to be using it from now on. And I'll press Shift A. Then under color, you can left click invert or you can search it. I'll plug it here, and now what's happening is this invert node is flipping things. And since white represents the value 1, that means that the bricks themselves will now be white instead of black. So they'll be protruding outwards. And this does the exact same thing as the invert checkbox on the bump. But we need to use an invert node to bake the texture since we're doing it with the emission. Then I'm going to come under the bake tab in my render properties and change it from combined to emit. Now I'll press Shift A, I'm going to add a texture and I'll left click image texture. I'll then press plus new and I'm going to left click this, drag it down quickly and type in Shift 8, which will give us the star sign, and then 4 since we want this to be a 4K texture. And now you can see it's changed it to 4096. Keep in mind the lower quality the image, the poorer the quality of displacement map we're going to have, but 4K should be more than enough. I'll press OK, and if you see my viewport here, it's gone black. That's because I have in this drop down here color set to texture, where by default it's set to material. You can use this if you want, but you don't have to. I'm going to keep it on texture so we can see what our map will look like. Since texture will display the image texture even if it's not connected. This is obviously only for the solid view though, and if any of that sounded confusing, you can easily just erase it from your brain and learn it at a different day. Then I'm going to change my color space to non-color. Since height maps, displacement maps and bump maps, which is what this is, we'll use non-color color space. I'm then going to rename it to displacement brick map. I'll save my file by pressing Ctrl S. Now before we bake, we're going to need to add a plane. So I'll press Shift A, left click plane, G and X, then I'll click this drop down and left click brick. The reason we're adding a plane is to make sure we bake the entire texture, since the default UV will just be one big square. It's also worth noting that remember this brick node here inside is using a UV texture coordinate. So if you're doing anything different from what I'm doing here and you're having issues, it may be because you haven't set the texture coordinate up here. Then I'll left click my displacement brick map and I'll left click bake. Alright, so the baking is now finished. You may find that it will stay on 100% for a solid 5 minutes, but that seems to be a pretty normal occurrence, at least when I'm doing 4K textures. So from here we have a couple of options. We could do displacement in the shader editor, which we could have actually done without a displacement map, but we're not going to do that today for 2 reasons. One, it's really slow on my computer when I'm recording, and 2, most computers struggle to handle it. Another thing to note is the alternative method, which is using the displacement modifier, works in Eevee as well, so that is a big positive. So I'm going to go ahead and press X to delete this plane here. I'm going to left click my wall first, and I'm going to come into my render preview. I'm going to unplug my emission here, so I'm just going to plug my bump into here and delete this bump since I'm not using it. I'll save these 2 nodes for later just in case. Then I'm going to left click on my spanner icon, which is our modifier properties menu, and I'll left click displace. I'll turn my mid level to 1 just to bring my cube back to its normal size, and I'll press plus new. Then under this texture window here in image, I'm going to choose this drop down and choose displacement brick map. Another thing I'm going to need to do is save my image. This is really important since it won't be packed into the Blender file by default. So I'll left click image with a star beside it and left click save as, and you can choose a location to save it. Awesome. Now I've saved my map. I'm going to check my settings. We can see it's still using non-color space, which is perfect. And I'm going to left click on my spanner icon again, and I'm going to change my coordinates to UV. This will now use the UV of our object. Then I'll turn down my mid level to 0. But you'll notice there's a problem. Our displacement displacement clearly hasn't worked. And the reason that is because displacement edits geometry or vertices, not normals. So I'll need to add a modifier and add a subdivision surface. I'm going to set mine to simple, and I'm going to move it on top of my displacement modifier. So to do that, I'll left click this drop down and left click move to first. And I'm going to turn up my levels viewport to, let's say, 5 for now. And it looks like we're going to need to change our mid level to 1. Now, a problem we will encounter here is we don't have enough geometry. And there's two ways we can fix this. First way is we can add the second subdivision surface modifier. So I'll turn this up to the max, which is 6. Then add modifier, subdivision surface, then I'll move it to the top, change it to simple, and we can increase this until we're happy with the result. And we also might need to turn down our strength. So for here, I've gone for something like 0.05, might even go a bit lower. 0.03 seems to give a nice result for now. Before we go back into our render preview, I'm going to do the same thing on our UV sphere. So I'll left click my UV sphere. Also make sure all your subdivision surface modifiers have the levels viewport the same as render. I'm going to left click on my UV sphere and I'm going to press add modifier and I'm going to choose displace. Then we can simply choose our texture again, change our coordinate to UV, and leaving it at Catmull Clark 5 seems to do a good job so far. We can increase the level to 1 just to bring it back down to its normal size, and we can put the strength to something like 0.03 as well. And there we are. That's quite nice. You can see we have some jagged bits on the top here, and we should be able to fix that by adding a bit more geometry. But for this tutorial, this is a pretty good result. Now I'll hold down Z and I'll change back into my rendered view, and here's our result. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. In the next video, we're going to be making our decay part of our shader so we can transition between the two. This is based off of Shigaraki's quirk from the My Hero Academia. So hope you will enjoy that video. With that though, I would like to congratulate you for making it all the way to episode 11 in this course. We have 2 more episodes and then we're finished. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.